A group of young women brought a Senate congressional hearing to a stop yesterday with testimony that was both enraging and heartbreaking as they recounted one of the biggest sex abuse scandals in recent memory. The U.S. gymnast who famously spoke out against serial predator Larry Nassar, the team doctor who sexually abused hundreds of girls and women over 2 decades and who is now serving up to 175 years behind bars, testified on Capitol Hill yesterday about how the FBI botched the investigation from the beginning.
To be clear, I blame Larry Nassar, and I also blame an entire system that enabled and perpetrated his abuse.
What is the point of reporting abuse if our own FBI agents are going to take it upon themselves to bury that report in a drawer?
It disgusts me that we are still fighting for the most basic answers and accountability over 6 years later.
For his part, FBI Director Christopher Wray, who did not lead the agency at the time, told lawmakers there was no excuse for the agency's failures.
The actions and inaction of the FBI employees detailed in this report are totally unacceptable. It's my commitment to you that I and my entire senior leadership team are going to make damn sure everybody at the FBI remembers what happened here in heartbreaking detail.
So what went wrong, and will anyone other than Larry Nassar be held accountable? Joining me now to discuss is Mary Mazio. Mary is a former Olympic rower who is now a prolific documentary filmmaker, and Natasha Tidwell, a former police officer and federal prosecutor for both the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. Natasha, Mary, it's good to see you both.
Hey, Jim, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for joining me. Mary, can I start with you? How was Nassar able to operate in USA Gymnastics and molest so many women for so long?
You know, I think it's excruciating, right? And he was operating under the guise of this, procedure. And I think there was a lot of trust given to him. And what's fascinating, Jim, and I may have said this to you before, I remember training out in Colorado Springs, and I was part of the rowing team, and we're a little bit older. And seeing the gymnasts walk in, they are little girls, and they are physically little, they're young, and they walked in and they would be training, and no mirth, no smiles. Even back then, and that was 1992, there was this, it was obvious that their childhood was being robbed. Now, nobody really knew about the extent of this. I think Larry Nassar, quite frankly, is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, well, and a lot of people think it's not just USA Gymnastics, but the whole Olympic movement, unfortunately, that's tarnished by
well,
this.
And I think you're going to see anywhere you see young children that are competing, and I think this obviously calls for sort of minimum ages. Should you be having these camps where parents aren't allowed, right? I think, especially for young athletes, I think all of this, I think you might see this with skating. I think you're going to see this, again, any of the athletic disciplines where you have very young children that are able to...
regardless of age, though, the people in charge can go out of their way to protect the people who end up being the victims rather than the victimizer. Natasha, I listened to Christopher Wray yesterday, and I'm saying to myself, it's great that he apologized. It is great that he says, I acknowledge I can't even explain the failure on the people in our Indianapolis office to do their jobs and to not lie. They did lie. That's not much of an explanation. How was this allowed to happen?
Yeah, Jim, it's astounding, really, except it's almost not, right? I don't remember what the context was. I think it was in the entertainment industry, but someone said the answer to all your questions is money, right? And so when you look at the USOC and USA Gymnastics, and you're right, that this isn't sort of the first time that this has happened, and it won't be the last time, because these are revenue generating sports and machines. Yeah. And so for the SAC in Indianapolis, who was angling for a job with the USOC, And so he's sort of turning a blind eye. And even within the USA Gymnastics, they had done their own internal investigation and knew all of the stuff and handed it off to the FBI, but still didn't do anything. And so in 2018, when Ropes and Gray and my friend Jim Dowd at Ropes and Gray issued their report for USOC, the emails, you know, the guiding sort of purpose was to keep a lid on Nassar, to keep a, make sure no one knew. And so I think that, the most startling or sort of the most heartbreaking part of this, not only is what Michaela Maroney and what these young girls went through before, but the fact that there were more than 70 instances after people in a position to stop it knew about it and nothing was done. And so, the long answer to your question is there's nothing that Christopher Wray can do or say to make this right, except for the good start is to have some measure of accountability. The SAC was allowed to retire. They finally fired someone on the eve of this congressional hearing, but it's not nearly enough to sort of remedy what's already been done.
Well, exactly. Let me follow up on that, Natasha. The thing they can do, Mary, 1 second, if I may, the thing they can do, Natasha, is prosecute these damn FBI agents. I mean, in one case, the guy who was fired, as you say, coincidentally 2 weeks before this hearing, is documented to have lied, not only delayed doing anything, but lying. This other guy, just to clarify what you said a minute ago, at the same time that he is doing nothing and lying in his reports about what these young women told him, he's negotiating with the head of USA Gymnastics for a job with the Olympics Committee. How have they not been prosecuted for criminal behavior, Natasha?
The IG report that just came out that is the subject of the congressional hearing says that the Department of Justice declined to prosecute these cases. And so I think that we need to sort of explore how that is, that they could give these blatantly false statements to federal investigators and not be prosecuted, because anyone else who did that would certainly be prosecuted. And so, I don't have a good answer as to why the department would decline prosecution, because it seems as if you want to stop people from lying to federal agents, they bring about 1,001 charges against any number of people, Martha Stewart, whomever, for lying. But this time people lied, and at least 70 girls were molested, and nothing is being done from a criminal perspective.
Mary, I want to pick up on what you said. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes, Mary.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the other challenge, having had really interesting conversations with law enforcement, the FBI, around sex trafficking of children. It is clear that the FBI is overwhelmed with child abuse cases. And this very well may, so you have the complete bungling of what is a high profile Olympic case. But I think this is endemic when it comes to issues of sexual assault of girls and women, like period, full stop. And I think the FBI has its hands full with child abuse. I remember saying, how come there's no enforcement around sex trafficking? And it was like, we don't have the personnel. It is not an excuse. I think,
but it's one thing, if I may,
as
Mary.
Natasha said, there's bandwidth for Martha Stewart. Well, why isn't there more bandwidth to protect girls and women from sexual assault?
Yeah, it's one thing not to be able to act because you're under-resourced. It's another thing to affirmatively lie about what you were told by survivors. But Mary, staying with you for a minute, away from the FBI, but back to the Olympic movement, I want to get back to your comment about this being the tip of the iceberg. You add this, which is the most egregious, to the fact that so many women athletes are talking about how their shoe companies discriminate against them when they get pregnant, to people like some of the greatest athletes on the planet talking about how the crushing mental health burden doesn't just come from the stress of the sport, but often from the men and women who lead the sport. I mean, this is from corner to corner, like epidemic proportion, is it not?
It is, and it's excruciating. The other problem that you have is that safe sport, if you're an athlete reporting a safe sport violation, you have to be willing to go public. What young person is going to be willing to go public with their Olympic aspirations about to be dashed? And that is, I think, part of the challenge with all of this. I think the other thing is you see this media-wide who won, who's the golden child, who's getting the visa endorsements. And that, I think it's somebody did a study, less than 115 athletes will walk away with a gold medal, right? Out of the summer games or whatever it is. a fraction actually win medals, and yet the intense glass cage pressure on these athletes, and many of them are very young women. It's excruciating, Jim.
You know, Natasha, last thing, getting back to accountability, if I can, there's a proposed $425 million settlement from USA Gymnastics, twice the level of what was already rejected by this group of young women. Again, there's that. There's the mea culpa from Director Ray. If you're back on the show in a year, is that going to be the end of accountability, writing a check and an apology from the head of the FBI?
Well, I certainly hope not. And, you know, and as was alluded to, it's not, when you look at what the investigation was, and there wasn't much going on there, but the FBI really needs to take a look at it is in the investigation of sexual assault and sexual abuse of women and girls and the minimization of the voices of women and girls. But when you listen to Michaela Maroney say that the agent, as she's crying, is saying, well, is that it? He didn't even write a report when he was done. So there's no sort of trauma-informed interview practices. They're doing this over the phone with a 16-year-old girl. So I'd like Christopher Wray to come back in a year and say, you know, much like what happened in the wake of Whitey Bulger and the high echelon informant program, is to say that we have revamped the way that we interview survivors and victims and complainants, the way we investigate sexual trafficking, because if we have the resources to investigate all this other stuff and to bring people to account, I don't know why we're not doing it here. And it speaks to how women and girls are treated in this country and throughout the world.
Well, if we add to that a couple of people sharing a cell with Larry Nassar, that I think would be a perfect end. Mary Mazio, Natasha Tidwell, it's really great to see you both. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Jim. Bye-bye.
Jim.